accept stress as a reality, accept that stress is helpful in the short term, but learn to adopt practices that allow you to clamp down on stress when you feel like it's not serving you or it's been going on for too long. And those tools and the science behind those tools are a big part of what my laboratory at Stanford has been about, and what the work with my collaborators at Stanford has been about, is figuring out what can people do to control their stress. Because I think a lot of people just feel like stress is like getting thrown into the current of life, and you just have to wait until the current slows down. And that's absolutely not the case.
This is a long time in the making. So many of my friends have been telling me about you, and I've been diving into your world, and you are just blowing me away. I got to ask you, because this is something I haven't heard when I've been checking into your work. Why the brain? What got you so fascinated with the human brain?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be here, and admirer of your work as well. So the brain is super interesting to me because it's unlike any other organ in our body. And it is an organ, right? Brain, and I like to include brain, spinal cord, and nervous system because basically they're all connected, and all the organs of the body are communicating back to the brain too. But the brain is really a unique organ because it can change itself. It's one of the few organs that, first of all, organizes the operations of all the other organs. So a lot of people don't know this, but the reason that your heart beats the way that it does, the reason that you breathe the way that you do, the reason that your immune system turns on or off is because the nervous system tells it to. It's an accelerator and a brake on all the systems of the body. But in addition to that, it can change itself so that it functions better. It has this property that we call neuroplasticity, which is literally the ability of the cells to change their connections so that the brain functions differently tomorrow or the next day than it currently does. And that is an incredible property because basically what it means is that you have an organ sitting in this hard skull thing of ours that can learn, and because it's in that hard skull, it doesn't have access to the outside world. As weird as this may seem, it doesn't really know anything about what's going on except what the eyes and ears and nose and mouth, et cetera, tell us. And it takes that and makes good guesses about which ways it could change in order to function better. And to me, that just is a landscape that's both beautiful and mysterious, but also that is exciting enough that I can't help myself but to work on it.
Yes. So was it little Andrew that was fascinated with the brain, or where did that spark come from?
Yeah, there was a early life version of this. I think I was about 6. I was 6 years old when I decided that I would work on the brain, but not because I understood what it was or how it worked or what the mysteries were, but because basically my dad was a scientist and he was a physicist, and I said, well, I want to do that because most sons want to do what their dad does. I looked up to him, and he said, no, you don't want to work on physics because most of the basic problems there are worked out. You should work on something that is far less worked out. And I said, well, like what? And he said, the brain. I said, okay, well, I'm going to figure out how the brain works. And to be clear, I have not figured out how the brain works. And nobody has. But then there was a very long period of time in which I wasn't focused on school or biology. And it really was in college that I took a course from an amazing physiologist who studied temperature regulation and hormone regulation and drug-seeking behavior and addiction. All that stuff got me really excited about experimental science. And I tripped and fell back into this question of how the nervous system works. And that's pretty much all I've been doing since I was 19. I'm 46 now, and I've been just wholeheartedly obsessed with it.
That's amazing. Yeah. That's amazing. And speaking of those different influences that you kind of picked up from that teacher, I'm going to ask you about something that a lot of folks don't think about. And that is, we hear stress as being something that's kind of negative or it's bad for us. But in fact, stress is one of the most important things for healthy development of our brain. Let's talk about how stress is actually beneficial for our brains.
Yeah, great question. I think we've all heard that stress can make us sick and that stress can kill us. And I think we need to be clear that stress can be both good for us or bad for us, depending on how long it lasts and how extreme that stress is. So there are a couple of things I think we can all agree on. One is that trauma, intense fear, things of that sort, those are not good. I mean, if we can avoid exposing children to those things, it's for the better. Fortunately, there are ways to rewire the brain to relieve trauma and extreme fear and phobias. That's a lot of what my lab works on. And of course, there are a lot of laboratories working on that. But we can say a few other things for sure. First of all, you can have stress without having trauma. You can have stress without having fear, but you can't really have trauma and fear without stress, right? And then anxiety is one that gets thrown around. People say, I have anxiety. Anxiety is sort of stress about the future, but I think we can set anxiety aside and really just talk about stress and say a couple things. First of all, stress includes the mind and the body. It involves speeding up of the heart rate, speeding up of the breathing. Our pupils actually dilate when we're stressed, and it literally changes the way that we view our environment. It changes the optics. It tends to make our visual field narrower, so we get kind of a tunnel or soda straw view of the world. When we're relaxed, that aperture, that view of the world dilates and gets bigger, literally. And that's because as we stress, the lens of our eye moves and there are changes in the structure of the eye. It's incredible. Short-term stress, where we feel triggered by something or we wake up and we realize we didn't do something, that causes the very rapid release of this hormone called adrenaline. And the equivalent chemical in the brain, just to confuse people, scientists decided to call the hormone in the body adrenaline, but the chemical in the brain, which is adrenaline, they call epinephrine, but they are the same thing. Okay, so it creates alertness of the mind and a kind of a hyper focus on whatever is happening. So the troubling text message, the troubling news article, the troubling comment, whatever it happens to be. And our world shrinks and gets very focused and very intense because the adrenaline in our body tends to make us immediately alert, which is really incredible if you think about it, right? I mean, these are powerful systems. Now, that short-term stress, or I should say that stress, provided it's in the short term, is not necessarily bad, because one additional thing that adrenaline does is adrenaline and short-term stress causes the release of cells in the body that actively fight infection of all kinds, bacterial, viral, etc. And this makes sense. I mean, if it were truly the case that stress reduces the functioning of your immune system, well, then anytime we had a challenge to our immune system, we would die, right? That can't be the case. And it's actually the opposite. So there are some really good data that are published in excellent peer-reviewed journals showing, for instance, that things like intense breathing or an intense episode of stress or a cold shower, all of which release adrenaline into our body. If you ever got into cold water, you're, oh my goodness, and your eyes go wide and you're filled with adrenaline. That adrenaline response mobilizes the immune response in a way to prepare for whatever challenge is coming. Now, if you've ever been stressed for a long period of time, you've been caring for a loved one, you've been challenged with work or financial things or family things or mental anxiety that goes on, and then you finally rest, typically that's when you get sick because your system isn't up on guard. Now, this doesn't mean that we should seek out stress necessarily. The real key is to be able to experience stress, but then to be able to shut off the stress response. And earlier, you and I were talking about this. For instance, we have a stress hormone called cortisol. It is a healthy hormone, provided it's released at its highest levels early in the day. When we wake up, it is released and then tapers off. And maybe throughout the day, you have a stressful text message, you see something online, you have these little spikes in stress, but provided they come down, that's fine. But when you start seeing peaks in cortisol toward nighttime again, that's actually a signature of depression. That's a signature of sleep problems. That's a signature of metabolic disorders. So the real key is accept stress as a reality, accept that stress is helpful in the short term, but learn to adopt practices that allow you to clamp down on stress when you feel like it's not serving you or it's been going on for too long. And those tools and the science behind those tools are a big part of what my laboratory at Stanford has been about, and what the work with my collaborators at Stanford has been about, is figuring out what can people do to control their stress. Because I think a lot of people just feel like stress is like getting thrown into the current of life, and you just have to wait until the current slows down. And that's absolutely not the case. There are things that we can all do that don't involve ingesting anything, taking anything at all, that can help us reduce our stress levels.
That's so good, so powerful. So when you're talking about that rhythm, and this is something I'm fascinated with, and I know you are as well, circadian medicine and looking at how our bodies are, we evolved really synced up with the planet, the diurnal patterns and the nocturnal patterns of life. And now today we can hide out in this room, for example, and kind of try to ignore what's happening out there. But our systems are always trying to kind of sync up. And having that exposure to sunlight in the mornings, which we were talking about at the beginning of the show, which we could definitely talk about now, helps to kind of set the template for a healthy release of cortisol, serotonin production in the morning, which that's a precursor for melatonin. There's so much good stuff there. But what I would see early on in my career was people, we would call them tired and wired, where the cortisol seemed to be too low in the morning, too high in the evening, and wondering why they're not sleeping well. And cortisol, again, it's not that it's bad. It's just when it's produced and, the amounts, like that association. I think I think one of the big issues today is that we tend to put things in this black or white thing. Right. Stress bad,
right?
Cortisol bad, this Hulk smash kind of version, when it's really just this cascade, and it's really just kind of where it fits in our lives.
Yeah. I mean, as a general theme of human biology, the human body and mind are so incredible because it uses generic chemical signatures or chemical tools in order to respond to all sorts of things, right? Life is very different nowadays than it was even 10 years ago, or certainly 50 or 100 years ago. But remember that all the systems of the human body and mind, they've been around for a very long time. And the reason that we've gotten as far as we have, and that I'm an optimist, that we are going to continue to progress as a species, is that these systems work really well to deal with challenges of different kinds. So we have a sort of a general system for mobilizing us, and that's what the stress system really is. It gets us moving. That's why when we have a stressful episode, we tend to shake, our heart is beating, we tend to, our eyes go open. It's designed to move us, not necessarily just away from predators. You always hear that, that stress is a carryover from when we were hunted by lions and things like that. Look, I'm sure that's true, but I'd be willing to bet that 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, people still had financial challenges, relationship challenges, all sorts of challenges. So the stress system is there to respond to any of those. And we also have reward systems that are there to make us feel good about pursuing certain things and feel good about human bonding and things of that sort. So there's really only a basic handful of ingredients of chemicals inside of all of us that drive us toward or away from certain behaviors. You mentioned morning sunlight, and I think it's worth focusing on, because if there were one set or even just one practice that can fundamentally change your ability to cope with stress and to sleep better, which, as we know, is the fundamental layer of health, of all kinds of health, it would be to view morning sunlight, ideally within 30 minutes, but certainly within 60 minutes of waking up. This is a very simple practice that's anchored in a lot of biology. I know you've written about this before in your book. It's quite simple. We can just list off what the practice is. It's basically get outside. Ideally, you don't do this through a window because of the way that windows filter out the light that you want to view. You get outside. If you can do it safely without sunglasses, don't wear sunglasses. On a clear day, maybe 5-10 minutes would be even better. On a cloudy day, 20-30 minutes. And if it's really overcast and you're in England in the middle of winter or something, trust me, there's more light outside even on that cloudy day than there is indoors with bright lights. Get outside for anywhere from 10 to 60 minutes early in the day. If you have to check your phone out there, do it. But ideally, you get outside, you get that sunlight exposure to your eyes. You don't have to look directly into the sun because there's a lot of what we call photons, light energy around. Those photons, the light energy, and this sounds very mystical, but it's not. Literally, it's captured by neurons, nerve cells in the back of your eye. That signal is then sent to the master clock in your brain, sits right above the roof of your mouth. And that master clock sends out signals, chemical and electrical signals, to all the cells of your body. All the cells of your body have a 24-hour clock. And that is not a coincidence. It's timed to the rotation of the earth every 24 hours. So that basic behavior of going outside each morning, you can wear eyeglasses, you can wear contacts, and doing that for 10 to 60 minutes will fundamentally shift your well-being. It times your cortisol to the correct early part of the day. It tends to ensure that the cortisol bump won't happen later, so it can offset some symptoms of depression. It also sets a timer, as you mentioned, on the serotonin melatonin pathway so that about 16 hours later you start getting sleepy so you can fall asleep well. And on and on and on and on. The question I always get is, what if I wake up before the sun? Well, if you wake up before the sun and before the sun rises and you want to be awake, turn on as many lights as you can. And then when the sun comes out, go outside. But this practice, it sets the foundation for your ability to cope with stress. It sets your capacity to deal with everything. And I could list off 20 or more positive changes and impacts that this creates. Some people find that just this one behavior leads to a very large positive effect on mood and ability to sleep. The other thing that I would tether to this is, if possible, and I do think it's possible, unless you're doing shift work or something of that sort, really try and avoid viewing bright artificial lights of any color, not just blue light. Screen lights, at-home lights, dim those down, way down, or don't have them on at all between the hours of about 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. There's a study that was done by colleagues of mine at National Institutes of Mental Health and also at Brown University, showing that if we expose our eyes to even a little bit of light late in the day or at night, late in the day meaning 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., that actually can cause reductions in important chemicals that create a sense of well-being, like dopamine. It can create deficits in learning, can create more stress in the subsequent days. So if you are not getting outside in the morning and getting sunlight, and you are on your phone in the middle of the night, even if that phone is dimmed way down, you are setting yourself up for a very challenging situation. Now, if you do wake up and you need to be on your phone for whatever reason, just dim it way down and try not to do it too long or too often. But those two practices, I think, really can help anchor people and anchor their stress system so that it's resilient and it can respond to things, but then it can turn off. Otherwise, it's like being on a bumpy ride out to ocean, which if anyone's ever been on that sort of thing, it is really uncomfortable. There's no settling in. We always feel like we're, as you said, tired and wired, or that little things can kind of knock us over.
Yeah, we're kind of living this residual hangover effect. You know, we don't really realize it.
Right.
So this is such simple, and this is a no cost.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't cost anything. It takes a little bit of discipline. I confess there are days that I wake up and the blinds are closed because I like to keep the room dark when I sleep. And I immediately get on my phone and I'm checking email and I'm doing this. And I think, okay, 15 minutes, I'll go outside. In 20 minutes, there are days that I miss. If you miss a day, just jump right back on. You're not going to collapse all the good and positive benefits of these practices by missing one day. So you can hop right back on. And if you really want to black belt this process, you get some light in the morning. You also get some light in the afternoon, natural light before the sun sets. And then you avoid light in the middle of the night between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. Or you dim it way down if you need to use lights for safety reasons or work reasons. If you do those three things, I would be very surprised if you didn't experience tremendous positive benefits. People's appetite tends to regulate. They feel less jittery. They have fewer anxiety attacks. They feel less depressed. They feel more present, able to focus. They sleep better. All the things that then start an upward spiral, right? Because when you're sleeping better, then everything else gets easier. When you're sleeping poorly, everything else gets harder. So it's very straightforward, zero cost. It just takes a little bit of dedication to do it. And you can make it a nice practice. You can take your coffee outside. You can if you must, you can take your phone outside, although ideally you would just kind of breathe in your environment a little bit and look around as opposed to always being in a box about this big. And I should mention that when we are looking at our phone or any small space, we are essentially recreating that experience that stress and focus creates of contracting our aperture, making our visual aperture like looking through a tunnel or a soda straw view. And that's a powerful, positive thing when we want to be focused. It's our ability to engage in conversation and not get distracted. But if you are spending most of your time looking in a little tiny box about the size of your palm, you are pushing your system much harder than you would be otherwise. I think a lot of people forget this. So sometimes just walking to your car without looking at your phone, doing something where you're moving through space, walking or even just driving and not focusing on this little itty bitty box can provide a lot of mental relief and physical relief as well.
This is powerful. I didn't know he was going to bring this one up because I don't know if anybody's ever had the experience of being on their phone for an hour or two and then feeling amazing after,
No,
just like,
that's a rare
you know what I
thing.
mean?
Right.
It's just like something happens and you're sharing exactly what it is. our biochemistry is changing. We're getting into a stress state
Yeah.
because of our focusing in on that one tiny space for that amount of time. Plus, not to mention all of the scanning and the scrolling and all the different brain candy that has there. So this is bringing to light one of the behind the scenes reasons why this is impacting our health.
Yeah, the dark days and bright nights, they say, is a quick route to depression, anxiety, or worse. There's a well-known phenomenon in hospitals called ICU psychosis, so intensive care unit psychosis. So people come into the hospital. These are people that are not suffering from psychosis of any kind. They might have a leg surgery or something. And many hospitals, unfortunately, have schedules and budget constraints that make it such that the lights are on at certain times. They're coming in. There's the sounds. There's the lights all the time. And unless they are right next to a natural light window, people start developing psychotic symptoms. They start hearing voices. They start, feeling really low, then really kind of manic. They start, start having all sorts of agitation. When they leave and they get back onto a regular sunlight schedule, it completely disappears. Now, people who already have existing psychotic symptoms, that's a different issue. But what this means is that we can all go crazy, a little crazy or a lot crazy, with just changes in our lighting in our environment. And when we're looking at our phone all the time, obviously it's not creating psychosis, but it is creating a kind of a low-level stress. And we have to remember that there's just one system. I mentioned the adrenaline from the adrenal glands and the epinephrine in the brain. There's one general system for stress. You don't get to, for instance, it's like a bank account. And so every time you're looking at your phone, you're pushing your expenditure a little bit more. So then when something happens, you're less prepared for it. You're really less resilient. Now, of course, I use the phone. The phone is wonderful. We communicate. I frankly think there are some elements of social media that are wonderful. You can learn on social media. I mean, you and I both teach on social media. So I'd be a hypocrite if I said that, the phone is bad. The phone is great, but it's just one way to interact with the world. And if you're spending too much time in that little tunnel, of which there are many things in that tunnel, if you're spending too much time in that tunnel, you will set up your biology to fail in the rest of life. I can confidently make that statement. So you have to control the number of hours, and also just sometimes just knowing what's going on when you're feeling like you're scrolling and like you don't even know what you're scrolling for. What are you expecting to see that it's suddenly going to seem that incredible? So, then again, there's some comedy specials that just came out on Netflix. And like the other day, I found myself on my phone for an hour, and this was time well spent, I felt. It made me laugh. I enjoyed it. That's time well spent. Communicating with people, that's time well spent. But we have to put that down and get back into life if we expect our biology to take care of us and for us to take care of it.
Yeah. These things sound very human, like when you were mentioning how many benefits we get simply from getting some early morning sunlight. It seems kind of miraculous that you get this benefit, but these are things that our genes expect from us, and it's amazing today that we have to have these conversations and to kind of fortify what we evolved doing in the first place. But it's also fascinating. And the cool thing is, again, this is a no cost intervention, and we can just bring a level of, I think a big reason is, our big problem is that we're not aware when we start to do these things. We get into the phone, and it's designed that way. Part of the reason we keep scrolling is it's kind of like a little slot machine, that's in our pocket, and I think we're really designed, or our incredible design has us to this place where we're sitting here today. We're kind of driven to seek out things and to explore and to find out, and kind of that dopamine pathway even, and getting that little bit of a reward when we seek and we find, and we seek and we find. And so being more aware that that's happening, and then putting it in a proper perspective. Like, I love that you said that it's not that it's bad, any of this stuff. It's just how we use it.
Yeah. I mean, the desire to know what other people are doing and to communicate with them, that is a hardwired aspect of who we are as a species. It's wonderful. Curiosity. We could look at scrolling on the phone and we can remove some judgment and say people are curious. They want to know what people are doing. They want to know what's happening in other parts of the world. How exciting and important is that? And I think that we don't want to demonize it at all. You mentioned dopamine hits. I mean, dopamine is this molecule that really drives us to crave things and seek more of it. The problem is if we are in a constant mode of seeking, it's well known now that the amount of dopamine that we release to any behavior starts to drop. And pretty soon we're doing that behavior, scrolling our phone, for instance, and we don't experience the pleasure. And this is starting to happen because we've had about 10, 11 years where smartphones have really been prominent in society. And now people are scrolling reflexively. They're not really getting the dopamine hit anymore. They're not really experiencing much pleasure from it at all. And now the conversation is starting to shift toward the ways in which it's harming us. Now, unlike certain behaviors that are truly destructive for our health at the beginning, middle, and end, the social media is here to stay. The phones are here to stay. And I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm willing to bet that it's here to stay. People seem to like this social media thing, but it does have its issues. And so the real key is if you start dedicating a set number of minutes or hours per day that you're going to be on it, then what happens is you can continue to enjoy it. And I think we've overlooked that part of the phones are bad conversation too. We meaning that as this is now starting to surface, kids are always on their phones, et cetera. Well, kids love their phones. My niece loves her phone. She gets to talk to her friends, especially last year when everyone was separated and it was really hard on them. So, I think that setting a certain amount of time so that you can continue to enjoy the behavior. Now, it takes some discipline. But one thing that can really help, I think, in providing a runway for people to adopt these behaviors, in particular sunlight viewing in the morning and avoiding bright light exposure, late in the evening, in the middle of the night, is if people understand that we all have cells in our body that were dedicated for this practice. We don't have to go too far down the rabbit hole of mechanism, but we have specialized cells in our eyes that are waiting for that cue of what time of day it is in order to send it to that central clock that sits right above the roof of our mouth, which is a structure that is there for the specific purpose of informing the brain and body of when to be active and when to be asleep. So once, and they have names if people want to look them up, melanopsin cells in the eye, suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. I mean, we can give them names, but the names are less important, I think, than really understanding that they are there in you, in me, in everybody. Actually, even in blind people, provided they still have eyes, who can't see, that are pattern blind, they still have the cells that can set these clock mechanisms and regulate sleep and wakefulness. Obviously, if they lose their entire eyes, and they have, then that's not the case. But it's so vital to understand that this is like a limb that we all have. And so, of course, if we don't use it or we don't use it properly, we are going to start to suffer. So I don't think anyone ever doubts that the fingers on their hands are here for a purpose. Well, if you just keep your hand in a fist all the time, it's not going to feel good. And that's a very, mild analogy. But once people start to understand, we have these things for a reason. And if we use them in these simple zero-cost ways, the rest of the things sort of domino into place. Then I think there's more incentive for looking at those tools and for adopting those tools. And again, I get thousands of emails back, and I didn't invent these mechanisms. I always say I was not consulted the design phase. I did not create these mechanisms. They are there in all of us. But I get thousands of messages back of people saying, just by getting my morning light, taking my coffee outside, or sometimes people do it with their family or with their pet, just by doing that, they are sleeping better. And as I mentioned before, many, many other things improve.
Definitely. Another little intervention here is like jet lag that can really help if you're traveling, to do that practice. Another thing that can help with that, from Salk Institute, just shared this data, is a little bit of intermittent fasting.
Right.
Which this gets back to the conversation of stress, which I want to ask you about this, actually, having you here. A big part of stress, I believe, is your perception of the stress, is your perception of what it is or what it's doing to you, whether you're aware of it or not. So for us to become more resilient, for us to utilize stress for healthy development versus getting into the more dangerous aspects of stress, is the cold exposure, for example, is it more so, it's not just the thing, it's our perception of the thing. So what can we do to make ourselves more resilient to stress?
Okay. Both excellent points. So remind me to touch on intermittent fasting. That's the incredible work of my colleague Sachin Panda at the Salk. Terrific scientists. If people haven't read Circadian Code, I think that's a marvelous book. But we can touch on some of the highlights of intermittent fasting and why it helps with stress and many other things as well. But to your other question first. So if you think about the stress response, widening of the pupils, narrowing of the focus, elevated levels of energy in the body and adrenaline and all that, it's very similar to the response that we would call excitement. In fact, those are almost identical. To get technical, if one wants just to look this up or something, they're both what we would call increased autonomic arousal. The autonomic system is kind of like the how many RPMs you're idling at in your vehicle, right? So are you idling high or is it idling low? And so things are ramped up. The difference between stress and happiness, or stress and excitement, is, on the one hand, is just cognitive. It's whether or not it was caused by something that we like or caused by something that we don't like. That's really all it boils down to. The body doesn't have a separate system for alertness for stress versus happiness. It doesn't have that. Now, there are chemicals like dopamine and serotonin that get woven into the stuff that we like that are less present in our brain and body for something that we would call stressful. But if we were just to think about how to reframe our relationship to stress, that actually can be done. I have a colleague at Stanford. He's the associate chair of psychiatry. He's an MD. He's a wonderful guy, and I'm mentioning him. His name is David Spiegel because I'm about to quote him, and in my profession, attribution is very important. But he has this great saying, which is, it's not just about stress. It's about how you got into that state of stress and whether or not you had anything to do with it. So the difference between a terrible event in the world that stresses me out and, for instance, me choosing to go take a cold shower deliberately, is that in the one case, I actually chose the cold shower. Now, I might not like it. I might have to force myself to do it. But there does seem to be some mechanism that we're not quite sure how this mechanism works, but David's lab and my lab is trying to figure this out. There's some mechanism by which, when we choose to put ourselves into these moments of challenge where we're really elevated and we're having all the classic symptoms of stress, that it flips the relationship to one of a positive association. And that has two really important effects. First of all, you get the adrenaline response, you get the boost it's been shown that boost in adrenaline causes a boost in the immune system function, alertness. There's also a well-known, now well-established effect, meaning in the scientific literature, that you get a long and sustained increase in dopamine from cold water exposure, even a cold shower just for a few minutes in the morning. And yes, you can turn the hot water on afterwards. There's no law that says that you can't do that, which is a great relief to me. So you turn the cold shower on, it's stressful, you're forcing yourself to do it. And then most people find that they feel, all of a sudden, it's like, I actually kind of like that. What is that about? Some people always hate it, but they do it anyway. And then you turn the warm water on if you're like me. You've just created a dopamine release. You've just thrown in this feel-good molecule on top of the stress response, and you chose it. So that's one benefit, which is that you're enhancing your overall system in terms of your immune system, your feelings of well-being. But the other benefit is that then when something happens in the external world and you feel stressed out because of it, you recognize that state. You recognize, this is me feeling really alert. This is me feeling, and I've been here before, right? It's sort of like I haven't done this, but I've always wanted to do this. If you ever go to the track and you drive at 120 miles per hour around a track, that's very different than careening down a hill with no brakes at 120 miles an hour. Now, God forbid, I hope nobody ever has to careen down a hill with no brakes at 120 miles an hour. But God forbid, if you were in that situation, you would recognize that situation if you've been at 120 miles an hour before by choice. And I would be willing to bet your outcomes are likely to be better, as opposed to feeling like you've never been in that state. So what's really disruptive about stress is that we don't pick the stressful event. That's why we call it stress. It knocks us off course. But a lot of what my lab has been focused on is trying to figure out what are the things that can allow people to capture themselves when in a state of stress. Calm themselves down a bit. That's one thing. And we can talk about a tool that anyone can use, a zero-cost tool to do that. But the other thing is, how do you raise your threshold for stress? We hear about resilience and grit and mental toughness, and we have these amazing examples on social media and in the world and throughout history. But what hasn't really been explained or explored until recently is, how do we create a more resilient self? So if I may, there are two tools that you can use to push back on stress. Let's think about the first one as kind of a stepping on the brake when you feel like you're just too stressed. And there are a lot of ways to do that. You can take a vacation, which is not very practical in the moment, especially if you're dealing with kids or life or anything. You can't step out of life. You can do exercise, you can meditate, but those things require that you step out of the event. And much of life is about dealing with things as they come and not being able to leave the room, not being able to just quit your job because you don't like it. And so the tool that my lab has been focused on quite a lot is something that we call the physiological sigh. So physiological sighs were described as long ago as the 1930s. And actually, you do them every night while you're in sleep. And animals do them, in particular dogs, right before they go down for a nap. It's a double inhale followed by a long exhale. The animal lovers out there will learn to recognize this, or you can look for it in your pets. In sleep, whenever we have a buildup of what's called carbon dioxide in our body, it's stress. We're actually triggered to breathe by an increase in this gas called carbon dioxide. You don't have to know much about carbon dioxide, but what you need to know is that anytime that carbon dioxide gets too high, in sleep, we do a double inhale followed by a long exhale. Animals do this right before they go down to sleep. Now, it turns out that you can do physiological sighs deliberately in waking. If you're feeling too stressed, it's a double inhale through the nose. So it's followed by a very long exhale. Now, the second inhale is just a tiny one. You can barely sneak in any air, you'll find, because it's big inhale and then another little tiny one. That little tiny inhale, though, is important because our lungs are not just two big bags of air. They have little tiny sacs called alveoli of the lungs. And when we get stressed, those alveoli of the lungs collapse like empty balloons. And that second inhale reinflates them so that when we exhale all our carbon dioxide. And a lot of the stress response is due to too much carbon dioxide. So to make this very simple, if you're feeling too stressed, do a double inhale through the nose, followed by a long exhale. And chances are just one of those, but maybe repeating that 2 or 3 times, but chances are just one of those will immediately bring you back down to a very calm baseline. As far as I know, this is the fastest way to calm your system when you're feeling stressed. And the beauty of it is you can do it most any time unless you're completely submerged in water. The other great thing about it is that if you do it repeatedly, meaning as you move through life and you have stressful events and you do this physiological sigh, your system starts to react more robustly to the physiological sigh. It starts to calm you even faster and further. So much so that I know people who can't do too many of these or they get sleepy. It actually starts to put them to sleep. And it's actually a tool that some people use to calm themselves before sleep. They'll do, and they'll repeat that. And we have a study that's now out for review, so it's not quite done, but where people do this as a regular pattern of breathing. So that's kind of like slamming on the brake. Again, zero cost. You can do it anytime, any place. Some people might say, well, I have a deviated septum or I have trouble breathing through my nose. I can't breathe through my nose. If you need to do it through your mouth, you can, but ideally the inhales are through your mouth and the long exhale. The inhales are through your nose and the long exhales are through the mouth. Now, that's calming down, but in order to raise your stress threshold, to become more resilient, more gritty, or able to handle life better, there is a practice that you can use. One is the one that we talked about before. Get into a cold shower once a day for 1 to 3 minutes. It never feels good. I always say it's always like climbing over a wall. That first wall is always there. I wish I could give you a tool that would allow you to enjoy it on impact. But a cold shower, you'll know if it's how cold because it'll be really cold and you'll want to move away from it. 1 to 3 minutes of that and then turn on the warm water. And it will liberate the dopamine and adrenaline into your system. It will make you more resilient for stress that comes. And I guess it's not completely zero cost, but it's certainly cheaper than hot water. And most people, fortunately, have access to cold water. If you want to do ice baths and buy ice and that kind of thing, that's actually kind of expensive. It's like to really fill an ice bath is about $50 in ice. That starts, if you're going to do it regularly, that's a lot. So just cold showers, fine. You don't need cryo to go to a cryo device. If you have access to one, great. But that will release adrenaline. The other one is if you don't have access to cold water, you can try a different pattern of breathing, which is, we call it cyclic hyperventilation in the lab. But the other way to get adrenaline going into your system is to breathe as if you were really in a panic attack. And I just want to warn people who have panic attacks or who have a predisposition for really bad anxiety probably shouldn't do this. But never do this near water, no matter who you are. But basically, You breathe in and out deeply for 25 breaths. I won't do that all right now, but it's, you'll immediately start to feel warm. You'll start to feel agitated. You'll notice my eyes are a little wider than they were a few seconds ago. That's adrenaline. You're releasing adrenaline. Then exhale all your air and sit calmly with all that adrenaline in your system. What are you doing? You're learning to be calm when you have a lot of adrenaline in your system. This is a self-driven stress inoculation. And just to put a bow on this goes back to my colleague David Spiegel's comment. It's not just about stress. It's how you got there and whether or not you had anything to do with it. And so these are tools that you can do. You don't even have to do them every day. The intense breathing, 25 breaths followed by an exhale and hold. You could repeat it if you want a few times. Don't hold your breath to see how long you can hold your breath. Just when you feel the impulse to breathe, breathe. But many people report feeling really pleasantly calm despite being really alert. So it's great to do if you have to lean into life. And the incredible thing about this is that it really does shift your biology so that when stressful events come, you feel more resilient and prepared. You will notice, I can deal with things better. But you do have to do this practice probably 1 to 3 times a week. You don't have to do it every day.
Yeah, this is amazing.
Yeah, sorry for the monologue, but I want to make sure that people got all the information. And again, I don't think we've talked about a single tool that requires a purchase or a potion. This is not mystical. There's no, I don't have anything against mystical practices, but there's no obligation to focus on your third eye center or to ground yourself with if you want to do all that stuff, great. But this is physiology. This is the hardware that we were installed with. Okay. And when you start tapping into that hardware, what I can also promise is there are all sorts of gifts that arrive. People talk about having insights. People talk about a problem that they couldn't work out or a relationship issue they couldn't work out. Insights start to come because you're literally shifting your state of mind and you're able to see things from a different perspective. And I always like to say that it's very hard to control the mind with the mind. This is a beautiful organ, this brain thing in all of us, but it's hard to control. But what we're talking about is using your body to control your mind. So when you can't control your mind, you really want to intervene using these what are really bodily functions, breathing, vision, these kinds of things.
I love that you brought up the mysticism side because that's where a lot of these practices even come from.
Right.
With the chaotic breathing or the breath of fire. But to put a description behind it, I'm really enjoying this because I've been doing that practice almost every day.
Which one? The deep breathing followed by breath holds?
For about 15 years.
Oh wow. What time of day do you do it?
Within the first hour. So probably about an hour after I get up in the morning.
You do it every day.
So I do the chaotic breathing.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And I'll do that for, it depends on the day, but there were times where I'll do it for several minutes. But now even just doing maybe 90 of those, you feel this state change, but then you just sit and relax into it. And again, one of those reasons why I don't respond to stress like I used to or other people. And for you to put a description behind why that is, of course, I know that the practice is doing all these wonderful things, for my nervous system, my brain. But really why I've implemented that practice so long is because of the sense of focus and clarity and being able to, if I'm trying to figure something out or visualize, I find that I solve a lot of problems, not trying to solve the problem, but just doing these practices.
Right.
So that's so powerful. And again, this is accessible for everybody. And I love that you mentioned we want to have some consistency here. It doesn't have to be every day.
Right.
And if you miss a day, no big deal. But having some modality of consistency here, So as you mentioned, maybe 3 times a week.
Yeah.
A couple of times a week.
If you do it for 2 days and then you miss a day, there's no rule that says that you have to use these things every day. Neuroplasticity, the nervous system's ability to change itself in response to experience, it responds. That process is engaged by the intensity of something. So if you really, I'd rather see people dedicate themselves to this practice once a week and really focus on it, not scrolling their phone while they're doing it, just setting aside literally 3 minutes to do this practice. Or when they're feeling stressed to say, oh wait, I can stomp on the brake of stress with this double inhale, long exhale through the mouth. I'd rather see them do that once a week than kind of just do it 50% devotion at, multiple times per week, because neuroplasticity happens when you focus on something and you really engage in that practice. Then the nervous system rewires, and ideally you don't have to do these practices all the time because you're not stressed as often. That's really that's the holy grail of all this. Now, I don't think anyone ever gets to a place where there's no stress in their life. And I think I don't even know that would be healthy for us. I mean, we are a species that responds to and often responds well to challenge over time.
It's how we grow.
It's how we grow. And I think that leaning, I always say, I like to ask myself at any moment, do I feel like I'm back on my heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass? Forward center of mass really meaning really feeling like I can get after it. Flat-footed, like I'm okay, or back on my heels, like this happens to me, I'm human, sleep deprived or ruminating on something too much, or not really making progress in the way that I'd like. These are tools that allow us to adjust that balance forward, flat-footed or back. And what's, I think, most useful about these sorts of practices is that you're not reaching to some external thing in order to solve the problem. Now, of course, social connection is great, and I enjoy food as much as anybody, and I enjoy exercise, and I enjoy various things, entertainment. But when you start taking control of your internal landscape in this way, that is extremely empowering, because it's a whole different business to be able to understand, even if you're trapped on a plane, sitting on the runway. I've had this happen and I'm feeling just stressed just thinking about it. You've been flying all day, you finally arrive and you can't get off the plane, or for example, you have to manage yourself there. And if you can take yourself out of a stressed episode, and yes, I have done this sort of breathing on the plane. I'll usually tell the person next to me if I'm going to do the deep breathing. I'll just say, I have this breathing practice that I do, don't worry. And I'll do it because it does look a little strange to do the deep breathing practice. Yeah. But the double inhale, long exhale can be done anywhere, anytime. It's pretty covert. Most people won't know that you're doing it. And that's powerful because you're learning how to drive the vehicle that is you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm just picturing you on the plane and me sitting next to you like, okay, guy, go for it.
You have to warn the person next to you. But I've seen stranger things on planes.
But, of course.
But I'll usually say something like, I'm a scientist, but and so I do this thing every once in a while where I measure my heart rate. I'll sort of say something first, but one of these days I should just do it. I should just jump in and just start doing the breathing.
That's awesome. But I love, when you mentioned, and this is such a powerful insight that you chose it, just that simple thing. And I'm grateful that you're looking into it more to find out, what is behind this, because it's a different scenario when you're choosing to turn on that cold water versus, you didn't pay the hot water bill and you're in this scenario,
right. Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, so we have an area of our brain called the prefrontal cortex, and it's much of what makes us human. It's the thing that gives us it allows us to put context onto our own biology. It allows us to say, my heart rate is speeding up because I'm excited that my favorite team might win this game, as opposed to because I think there might be an intruder in my home. It creates context. Normally, we let it make those interpretations reflexively, but we have the capacity to decide that something is good for us. Maybe it's not going to feel good at first, but maybe some guy on your podcast, on the Model Health podcast, told me that it was useful. So I'm going to explore it. So that curiosity can be superimposed on the experience. And look, I can't make the cold water not feel cold. I can't do that for you. No one can do that for you. But you can make the cold water experience a choice, and you can make it serve you, not just in the immediate experience, but as I mentioned, there's a 2.5, or maybe I didn't mention this, but getting into that cold water for 1 to 3 minutes leads to a 2.5 times increase in the amount of dopamine, this feel-good molecule, and that lasts several hours. And it's not a level of dopamine that's so high or so sustained that it's going to be detrimental. You're going to feel really, really good for a while after getting out. And that's a promise. I can't tell you you're going to like the experience of being in cold water. I can't tell you that you're going to like the experience of doing the deep breathing. But most people find that if they do it once or twice, they start craving it because they are craving the dopamine release that comes from it afterward. And that's not even mentioning all the other positive effects like improved circulation. Deep breathing of any kind is a lot like exercise. I wouldn't want to see people abandon exercise for deep breathing, but there's some interesting studies that are happening now of people that are paraplegic or even quadriplegic, trying to use deep breathing as a way to generate healthy circulation in the body and to get some of the enhanced mental benefits that come with more standard forms of exercise. So if you're chair ridden for whatever reason, if you can't exercise, maybe you're suffering an injury or something for whatever reason, the deep breathing is a pretty good substitute, at least in the short term.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about our approach to these things just a little bit more, because I think that this is similar. When you mentioned, you enjoy working out, for example, and I'm thinking about people's perception of lifting weights. Some people perceive it as extremely painful. They hate it. Like, it's just like, I don't perceive it like that. It's kind of joyous. It's just the way that I experience it is just like, I want more of it. Bringing that same mindset, what about with the cold exposure, where I'm not just like, oh my God, this is going to kill me, or this is, I hate this, or whatever it is, just maintaining a sense of calm or perceiving it as something that is enjoyable, for example. I know it's kind of hard to do with that example, but what about our building that stress threshold? If you understand where I'm going with this, what about our perception in that moment? If we can relax into it a little bit more, is that going to kind of help us to adjust to stress when life hits us with that stress?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually the important question. I also like exercising. I do. I don't know why, but I like it. What's hard for me is being stuck behind a desk all day and, folded up in an accordion shape, and that's unpleasant to me. I do like exercise, but I understand that some people don't. My sister hates the cold water thing. I've managed to get up to her shins so far, and then she's like, I'm done. And and I have to respect the fact that for people like her, some people just don't want to do it. They just don't want to do it. It's unpleasant. So she does other things to manage her stress and has adopted practices. The mindset piece is really key. So let's take the cold water example, because cold water is universal. Nobody escapes the sensation of cold when they're in cold water. So I think there are really two approaches. One is to try and relax your mind and your body while you are in the stress. That's one approach. The other is actually to lean into the stress. And this is something that our lab is working on, but it's hard to parse because it's very subjective. We can't really measure what people are thinking very well. Even if we were to do brain imaging, it's hard to do. But I'm intrigued by this. So it's a little bit like, for those of you that have your driver's license, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you've ever driven on a gravel road, there's a speed at which the dust is kicking up and it's in your field of view, and you're just probably going too slow. In that case, you speed up and you get the dust cloud behind you. However, if you go too fast, you start to slip out. So I feel like the cold water, the best analogy I can provide, it's a little bit like a gravel road. Sometimes it's better to speed up and to lean into it, to really, like, I'm going to muscle through this. I'm going to get to that 3-minute mark no matter what. What you're doing is you're actually adding adrenaline to meet the challenge, which is one of the fundamental reasons we have adrenaline, is to mobilize us and to allow us to meet challenges. So that's one way to approach it. The other way to approach it is to stay very calm and to try and relax into it so that you are kind of staircasing up the adrenaline response. You're taking more control. Here's what I recommend. It's very hard to predict how the cold is going to trigger your mind. You always know how it's going to trigger your body. You're going to kind of brace. You're going to, okay, I have to relax. I have to kind of stretch into this. So physically, you just always want to try and relax into the experience. But mentally, I suggest that people try it both ways. Some days you'll get in and you might just want to grit your teeth and think, I'm doing this because I told myself I would, or I really want to, and just really leaning into it, just like full rock and roll, just really into it. And other days, try and be as peaceful and as zen as you can. And I think you will know within the first 10 seconds whether or not you want to flip to the other approach. And I suggest whichever approach you pick to try and stay with that for about 10, but ideally 30 seconds. And then you will think, oh, I can actually just relax through this full 3 minutes. Or some days you'll get in and you'll try and relax. You're like, I can't do this. I really want to jump out. You'll notice that impulse to get out. That's when I would say, you know what? Hit the gas. Lean into this stressful experience. And then as you get out of it, just reward yourself mentally for having done it at all. And then it cues us at a point which I'd be remiss if I didn't make, which is that we've talked about rewards and dopamine rewards. If you want a practice of any kind to feel good, or exercise to feel good, if you don't already like it, subjectively rewarding yourself for doing it, just mentally, is very powerful. These forebrain influences, these forebrain neurons that we have, will allow us to reshape our relationship to events. And this is the reason why new parents can, maintain, grueling schedules of child rearing, because they're telling themselves this is important. Those subjective things matter when they see their kids flourish as a consequence of their own sleepless night. When they see their child growing, this is a reinforcing thing. And so we can override a lot of our discomfort just through thought. And I don't want people to place themselves into extreme discomfort, but when you push yourself into a practice, when you feel really, really challenged making it through the cold water, when you force yourself to do the breathing exercise, you are in a position to get more of a reward from it than less. Meaning, it's sort of like this. If you have to raise the temperature a lot in order to achieve a certain level of comfort, that's a lot harder. But the way that the nervous system works is you get more of a chemical reward from going from 0 to 60 than you do from going from 40 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour. It's just the way that the system works. If something's easy for you, there's no reason for your brain to reward it, and there's no reason for your system to rewire. Remember, rewiring of your system so that these things feel good or over time, or they feel easier to engage in, that's really triggered by how much of an intense stimulus it was. So the more intense it is, the harder it is to drag yourself to these things, the more you're in a position to actually benefit from them. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but if you think about it, it makes sense too.
Yeah, of course. This is a perfect segue to asking about the strength training side, for example, training our bodies. And I'm fascinated with this because there's so many different ways that we are impacting our brains through our bodies. Is there any science or any truth behind the statement that making your body physically stronger is going to make your brain stronger?
Well, let's see. So there's the health. There's just the pure health and longevity side. So I can fire off a couple of quick, well-substantiated bullet points. This isn't work that my lab's done, but I'm aware of the work. It's very clear that cardiovascular exercise, so not weight training, but something where you're breathing relatively hard and your heart's beating, elevated heart rate, doesn't have to be high intensity training. In fact, we're probably talking more about what people would consider zone 2 cardio. So where you have to struggle to hold a conversation, but you're not completely out of breath. It's very clear that 150 minutes to 180 minutes a week of that is tremendously beneficial for cardiovascular health, for longevity, for brain function, for cognitive function, offsetting age-related cognitive decline. We should all be doing this. And I confess the cardiovascular work is usually the last thing that I go to on a busy week, but it's something that I really enjoy once I start doing it or once I've done it. If you think about 150 to 180 minutes a week, it's not a trivial amount. It's an investment, but it's worth it. You're going to live longer, you're going to maintain your brain function longer, and you're going to feel better. I mean, everything's going to be better. Now, on the strength side, there are fewer studies of resistance training. However, if you look at brain function and longevity, it's very clear that the body is informing the brain about the status of your entire being, okay? And I truly mean that in the non-mystical sense. When we do load-bearing exercise of any kind, could even be air squats for some people, but if they're doing any kind of resistance training with weights or machines or body weight, there are actually hormones that are secreted from our bones. This is wild. This thing's called like osteonectin is an example of one that are secreted that go to the brain that enhance the survival and the function of neurons, of nerve cells in the brain. And at first, when I heard this, I thought, this is crazy. The bones are making hormones, but it makes perfect sense. The skeleton is a very important system in our body. How do the areas of the brain that control movement, how do the areas of the brain that control learning, how do they know whether or not you are still moving or not? Well, they could know because your heart is beating, but maybe your heart's beating really fast because you're stressed out about something. The only way that your brain knows that your body is being used and that your brain needs to continue to adapt and to stay strong is if you're increasing the load on your skeleton. And if you look at cognitive decline and loss of memory and things over time, and you look at bodily function and the loss of certain functions, what you find is that there are these weird things that are correlated with brain longevity. And some of them include, for instance, the ability to jump and land. Right. I was talking to my mother's in her, sorry, mom. She's in her mid 70s now. And we were talking about this because she said, I want to stay healthy. I want to keep my brain healthy. And I said, well, can you jump up and land? And she said, what are you talking about? That's crazy. And I said, can you jump up and land? I didn't want her to hurt herself. And we were talking about this. A lot of people as they age get injuries, hip injuries that take them out of commission. The ability to jump, not huge distances, right? But to jump and land and be stable doing that. Obviously, you don't want people harming themselves. That's correlated with brain longevity and body longevity. What is it? Well, it's not just about shuffling around. It's because the bones are taking that impact. So when we weight train, we provide load forces onto the bones. The bones send signals to the nervous system and to the brain, and so there's brain longevity. So that's it's a roundabout but very mechanistic way of answering your question, that indeed when our body is strengthened, our brain gets better at the neuronal health level. Now, in terms of resilience, which I think, and our capacity to deal with stress, this is an interesting one. I think there are several places where exercise carries over to an enhanced ability to deal with stress. First of all is all the indirect stuff, like it improves our sleep, it reduces inflammation in the body, provided that exercise isn't too intense or too frequent. So there's all the indirect ways that it supports us and makes us more capable. But then there are the pain points of exercise, and those come in different forms. One of the less discussed pain points of exercise is the one where you don't want to exercise and you do it anyway. That's making yourself mentally stronger. And here I'm sort of paraphrasing in a much less entertaining way than the great David Goggins, right? Not his whole thing, he's about many things, but a lot of what David's about is about taking yourself from way back on your heels, don't want to get out of bed, don't want to do something, and getting into that forward center of mass. That is a very valuable brain function, to be able to take yourself from a place of, I don't want to do it at all, it's the last thing I want to do, and I'm going to lean into this. That carries over. And then the other one is the pain that you experience, healthy pain, during the exercise itself. The burning of your lungs, the burning of the lactic acid buildup, the straining under a rep or something like that. And there your cognitive or your thoughts about what you're doing. I'm here because I chose to be. I might not want to be, but I chose to be. Those are two different things, right? I chose to be here. No one's forcing me to do this. I don't have a gun to my head. I'm doing this, and this is going to benefit me. Over time, that will change your relationship to effort. And the holy grail of life, I believe, is when effort feels good. And no one gets to be in that state all the time. But I think that when we push ourselves physically, we get multiple opportunities to learn to go from the I don't want to, I'm kind of, that's my voice in my own head, I don't want to, and then doing it anyway. And then you have to remember to reward yourself. And that reward should not be in the form of an external reward. This is very important. It's tempting to say, I'm going to reward myself with the meal. You can still enjoy all the things you enjoy, but the reward has to be one that you give yourself mentally. Because when you start to give yourself external rewards, you're teaching your brain that rewards only come from the outside. When you give yourself internal rewards, and you can even make this a 1-minute meditation practice at the end of a particularly hard cold shower, or you get out, you just sit there and tell yourself, this is good for me. I chose to do this. This is benefiting me. Those messages actually, I know it sounds a little hokey, but those messages actually help reinforce the whole process that you just forced yourself through. And it makes it more natural. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's phenomenal. Phenomenal. Well, this is a great, holy shit. That was so freaking awesome. Man, that's I didn't even think about that aspect. Like, I'm literally I don't do that internal reward mechanism.
And this is worth considering, because you are at a place now where you're doing things that are good for you. You're feeling good about doing them. And so then the question is, how do you get the most out of those practices? And I think that there's some pretty diabolical but fun things that you can do. I've been playing with this a little bit. Like this morning, I decided I really want to take a run. Normally, I hydrate and I drink caffeine before I do any form of exercise, like no caffeine, no exercise. Every once in a while, take away the thing that makes it a little easier or more pleasurable for you to lean into something. Now, obviously, you don't want to do it in a way that's going to damage you, right? Running barefoot on glass is not a good approach. But if you start to do this, and I really resented it. I was like, I want my coffee first. I really want it first. And then what I realized is you are tapping into this ability to deliberately create more friction so that you deliberately get more out of the effort. And I think that we've spent so much time as a culture trying to make things so easy for ourselves, putting food into liquid form so we can just slurp it down, for instance, in high calorie form. That's one of we even see this in kids now. I have colleagues at Stanford, maybe a discussion for another time, but who've talked about the fact that kids aren't chewing hard foods and their mouths, their teeth are disrupted, their breathing pathways are disrupted, they have sinus issues. Might sound trivial, but it's because of the soft foods. After a certain age, kids need to eat hard foods and chew, and adults do as well. They get sleep apnea. There's all these airway issues and structural issues, to say nothing of the cosmetic issues. The shape of people's heads are changing because of all the slurping down food in high calorie form. So creating some effort and some friction is actually really good for our biology. And we obviously don't want to go back to living in caves with no electricity and bathing in cold water and having to run up mountains every day for our food. But in some ways, simulating a little bit of what that was like in a voluntary way can absolutely benefit us. There's no question.
Well, speaking of food, there's also not eating food.
Right.
Fasting. And so this goes back to one of the possibly most beneficial nutritive approaches to stress, but this is putting our eating into a specific window. And as you mentioned, out of the Salk Institute, that's definitely where I've been really paying attention to. They're doing some great work there. Let's talk a little bit about that, because this is another one of those things that we're going to eat anyways, but the way that we eat, it's not just what we eat, but it's the when actually that can make a huge difference.
Yeah. And here I think, again, a huge nod to Sachin. I've known Sachin Panda for a very long time. He's done terrific work in a number of areas of biology and neuroscience. Wonderful guy. So he's really the expert on this, but I've tracked this literature for a long time. And the benefits of so-called time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, are many. So there is, just to be crystal clear about one thing, because people sometimes get caught up on this idea of, is intermittent fasting the only way to lose weight or maintain weight? And of course the answer is no. A person could eat from morning until night, calorie control, etc., and lose weight or maintain weight. That's clear too. The benefits of intermittent fasting, however, is that for many people, not all people, but for many people, restricting their so-called feeding window, or the time during each 24-hour cycle in which they're ingesting food, to about 8 hours or so, does a number of things that are positive. First of all, it's been shown that people can often adhere to that. They can stick to that much more easily than they can eating smaller portions. I'm one of these people. I can't eat half the croissant. I don't see croissants in halves. I only see croissants in wholes, and usually I see 2 or 3, meaning I can't eat just half the croissant. I'm incapable of doing that. I just have never done it. I don't plan to. But I cannot eat the croissant and then eat the croissant later. Okay, and many people find that that's more accessible to them. Sachin's lab and other labs have shown that even the same total amount of calories, limited to a certain period within each 24-hour cycle, actually can allow people to lose weight. Now, that's an interesting and kind of controversial statement, but ideally people are eating healthy within that feeding window. So we could talk about what eating healthy might look like. But there's also that when we start to fast, at first it's painful. We don't want to do this. It's that stress and anxiety and friction. We have to override our reflex to reach for food, etc. But it also creates a really beautiful scenario, because the dopamine system, this reward system in our brain, is tied to when we actually not just indulge in things, but anticipation. If we know that we are going to start eating at noon, the food that we eat at noon actually tastes much better to us than the food that we didn't have to wait for. And we've all experienced this. If you've ever waited for food or you couldn't eat, and then even trivial food really tastes delicious. It resets, it recalibrates our sense of taste. So we tend to pursue less of these so-called highly palatable foods, or these foods that, highly palatable sounds great, delicious. Highly palatable foods are foods often that have a lot of hidden sugars and other things that can disrupt metabolism. And I know you're familiar with all this. But time-restricted feeding is a beautiful way to create harmony with eating and create harmony within the reward pathways by which, we all need to eat sooner or later. So it's pretty clear that the 8-hour feeding window is a good target. Eating windows that are much shorter, where, some people do the 1 meal per day, only 1 meal per day, or 6-hour feeding windows. A lot of people feel gastric distress because they're eating so much during that short feeding window. Some people might benefit from that, but it does seem like 8 hours or 10 hours is a good thing to shoot for. Although I did learn recently that most people who are shooting for an 8-hour window actually are eating for a 9 or 10-hour window. People don't track this quite as well as they think they do. And then there are additional benefits, which are if you're eating at a pretty consistent time each day, your sleep tends to be better. And the general rules for fasting that I can observe from the literature are that you want to begin your feeding window at least 1 hour after you wake up, maybe longer, but at least 1 hour. And you want to end that feeding window at least 2 hours before you go to sleep. So where you place it will depend. There's some evidence that eating breakfast and lunch and a little bit in the afternoon and then stopping eating around 6 p.m., provided you have protein early in the day, is more beneficial for muscle maintenance and muscle gain in men and women. That's been shown of various ages. There's some evidence that placing the feeding window later, starting to eat around noon and then stopping to eat around 8 or so, is better. That's probably a schedule. The noon to 8 is probably a little more compatible with most people and social schedules, because you can usually just skip breakfast. People will let you skip breakfast, but if you're the person skipping dinner while everyone else eats dinner, at least in our culture, it's not really socially compatible. So I've been doing intermittent fasting for a long time. I'm not super strict about it. I will occasionally have some almonds or something in the morning, but I generally start eating sometime around noon, and I try to stop eating sometime around 8, but it usually ends up being closer to 9. And I think that it's a great way to enhance your sleep. You then have very predictable periods of focus during the day as well. You'll start to notice you have a lot of focus early in the day, or you can predict when your periods of focus will happen. And that can be great for doing work, et cetera. So I think they're just, and I could go on and on. I think there are a lot of blood sugar regulation benefits, et cetera. But again, if you're eating far more calories than you're burning, then it's going to be impossible to lose weight or maintain weight. But I think for most people, time-restricted feeding is a really great way to go about life. It also makes life less stressful because you don't have to think about food for certain periods of the day, and you know when you're going to be eating. So do you do time-restricted feeding?
Of course. Yeah. So this also makes you more resilient to stress and to be able to be aware of that voice in your head. Yeah. And, here it is 1:53 in the afternoon as of this recording. All I've had today was my 4 Sigmatic coffee much earlier. And
I confess I had something this morning after my run. But
so this is the great thing about it too, is like some days I throw in these longer fasting periods, whereas most days I'll probably eat around 10 or 11 for myself. But I've been doing this for, I don't even know how long, maybe 9 years.
Oh, that's great.
And
where did you first learn about it? Because Sachin's work goes back to about 2010. And of course, I should acknowledge, people have been doing time-restricted feeding for centuries. This is not something that was discovered at the Salk Institute, but the science and the benefits, one in particular, the benefits on liver health have been really impressive. That is something that is only recently known. But where did you initially hear about
now
this?
I remember it's 8 years, and it was Ori Hofmeckler.
I'm so glad you mentioned him. Israeli Special Forces guy.
That's
I
right.
know Ori. Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned him. He really deserves credit. It's the warrior diet.
That's right. Exactly.
He deserves credit for being one of the first people I ever heard. He said this thing of that you have to eat 6 meals a day or 3 meals a day. He said that's crazy. When he was in Israeli Special Forces, they were eating one time a day. And I think Ori's got to be in, sorry, Ori, if you're younger than this, but he's got to be in his 60s, and he is in amazing shape.
Exactly. That's the thing for me, even when I first picked up the tool, was I'm a very big proponent of results. Mm-hmm. And so just like, oh, this guy is at this level in life, and like, just look at him and his cognitive ability, like he's really onto something. Of course, when he's putting these ideas out, they sound very, very sketchy.
Oh, I brief Ori Hofmeckler, sir. I wrote to him years ago and said, I think your book is fantastic. I want to come talk to you. So I drove out to his house in Temecula, and we sat there. And he's also an animal lover, which I am too. I'm not a vegan, I confess, but I do love animals. And he had French bulldogs. He had a little pig running around. He had like all these, he had so much stuff going on there. And he told me about this compound called berberine, which is a tree bark that can lower blood glucose. Now, I don't take berberine personally. It's just not, it's not for me. But nowadays there's all this talk about metformin for lowering blood glucose. Berberine and metformin are basically identical in function. And he was telling me, there's this tree bark berberine. And I thought, this is pretty weird. Basically everything he told me that day, time restricted feeding, berberine. He was also talking about cold water exposure. He was talking about a number of other things related to high intensity training. Everything he told me that day is now showing up in the hardcore scientific literature and is all over social media. So Ori, if there were a prize that one could give for this sort of thing, he would definitely deserve it.
That's powerful. Yeah. Even in my latest book in Eat Smart, I mentioned stress mimicking nutrients. I picked that up from Ori. Yeah. So just it's so cool. And I love this that today we're able to validate these ideas, but we also have to pay attention to these anecdotal things too, and seeing the effectiveness, and not to mention Ori's his accent as well is pretty cool. So we'll put Ori's episode. I interviewed him probably 6 years ago.
I need to reach
5
back
years
to
ago.
him. Such a wealth of knowledge, and I agree. I think one of the big Ori does not fall into the camp I'm about to describe, but one of the major mistakes that we've made as a species is that we tend to shroud things in language. We tend to talk about things in, not you, obviously, you're doing an amazing job of clarifying and getting the message out there to people about health. But there's this problem within, I'll just say there's this problem in the yogic community, which is the same one which is in the community I'm most closely associated with, which is the scientific community, which is that the language confuses everybody and it acts as a distancing agent as opposed to a connecting agent. And so I have great respect for the yogic practices, and which of course go back thousands of years, as I have great respect for the scientific method and practices. But what they share in common, which is not so good for humanity, is that the names of things make it entirely impossible to understand what those things are about. So a big part of what my life is about is trying to look to these different people and practices, acknowledge the value of what they're doing. I'm not interested in washing out the traditions. That's not my goal. My goal is to try and bring a bit of mechanism alongside that, so that people that wouldn't naturally gravitate towards these things might think, oh, well, sunlight viewing, is this sun gazing? There are even these people, they call them sun eaters or something like that. Anyway, we can't eat the sun. But viewing sunlight is very powerful and useful, and we have melanopsin cells and suprachiasmatic nuclei. And so when you start to layer in the different practices with the underlying scientific mechanism, and then hopefully make it clear and accessible to people, we start to realize is we're all talking about the same things. And more importantly, we all want the same things. We are all trying to be able to deal with stress. No one wants to be so calm that they never experience any stress, that we can cope well, that we're gritty and resilient, but that we're emotionally flexible. And I think people like Ori I think they are really early pioneers that really do deserve the credit, or a certain amount of the credit really, for raising a flag and saying, hey, there's no rule that says you have to eat all day long. In fact, eating for shorter periods of time each day can have tremendous health benefits. And they embody the practices. Right. Like you said, you see them and you're like, he's on to something. Many of my colleagues, scientific colleagues, do time-restricted feeding. I've got colleagues that were finally able to lose weight despite many, many years of challenge, because they use time-restricted feeding. And again, there are other modes of nutrition that can work too. There's no debate about that. Everyone agrees. There are other modes as well. But for some people, it's really been a lifesaver for them.
Yeah. And, you just mentioned it. There's a lot of infighting because of language. And for me, it goes back to this quote attributed to Einstein that if you can't explain it simply, you don't know it well enough. So just striving to put that to the side. I think a big problem is people trying to sound smart, or trying unintentionally sometimes to overcomplicate things so that you're the oracle of this bit of data, versus like, let's help people, and have much more intersection of things than, even these different diet frameworks that are incredibly valuable. People they're not promoting a particular diet framework because they want to be a jerk or to hurt people. They're probably seeing results with their patients, right, or the people that they're working with, whatever the case might be. And there's so much overlap with all of these different frameworks, but people get caught up in the language or they get caught up in the minutia.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, I would say, the more closely somebody is tied to just one practice or protocol, the more rigid they're going to be about that, because that's their one thing. It's like a dog at the dog park and they got the one toy at the dog park. There's more than plenty to go around. And I think that, one of the most important things in my mind is to really understand what are the negotiables and the non-negotiables in terms of health practices, right? We all need to get good sleep. That's a non-negotiable thing. We all need time to perfect that process. We may probably never even perfect it. But then there are the negotiables. And I would say, in terms of time-restricted feeding, what's the best feeding window? How long and at what time of day? The one you can stick to consistently. And when I say consistently, I mean 80% of the time. And we actually know that. There are now data that show that if you do that 8-hour feeding window early in the day one day and then late in the day the next, that actually isn't as good for you as if you place it consistently early in the day most of the time. What happens then is all those genes, those clock genes that regulate different functions of your liver, your gut, your brain, those genes actually start to fall into a really nice rhythm. When you're moving that feeding rhythm window, around a lot, then the clock genes get disrupted too. You actually are jet lagging yourself while you're at home. You're not traveling, but your body thinks you're in New York one day and then you're in Los Angeles the next. So I think it's what can you do consistently? And for some people, they might say, well, the number of times I can get into a cold shower each week or do this breathing is 0. Well, that's where I would kind of lean, I'd turn that around and say, well, it's because there's so much resistance to it that you actually stand to gain the most from it, even through just a small step in that direction.
I love that. So the answer to what's the best feeding window is the one that you'll stick to, the one that you'll actually do.
The one that you can stick to 80% of the time.
It's the same thing with exercise.
Right.
People ask, what's the best form of exercise? The one you'll do.
Right.
The exercise that you'll actually do is the best form.
Right. And over time, I think, I'm sure you can attest to this, that will change over time. So if the one that you can do for the next 6 months, by the end of that 6 months, you may find you have a greater capacity to do more or less or change the form of exercise. I mean, the decision to do any one of these things or all of them is not a decision that you're going to do this for the rest of your life. You might, that would be wonderful. Hope that you'd at least get the sunlight viewing for the rest of your life. But, we all go through, dips and valleys and peaks of doing everything correctly. I mean, we're all human.
Right, right. This is true story. As of this recording, just yesterday, and I love this. I'm bringing this up because you said that this practice can actually make food taste better, which sounds crazy. But my youngest son, Braden, he's 10 years old. Yesterday, he wanted to fast. He's been saying, he's like, Tuesday, I'm going to fast. So he said this last week. And I was like,
of course, just decided this?
Yeah. And my brain is like, I don't know. He's got stuff going on. I don't know if this is appropriate. But he's been semi-intermittent fasting for quite some time. Whenever he's not going off to a class, it's like kind of external, so he's pretty well versed in just being comfortable in not eating something, especially first thing in the morning. So yesterday, Tuesday, he did his fast, and we gave him some fresh pressed juice. He had some soup, those kind of things. And I made some food for myself in the morning, and I was walking to my office and he was just asking questions about my food. He's like, oh, this smells so good. And I was like, what is your brain telling you right now? He's like, I really want to eat that. And I was like, and I asked him, so what does your brain tell you if you can't have it? Well, then I'm just going to go crazy. And I was like, is that actually true? Are you going to go crazy if you don't eat right now? He's like, no, it's not crazy. It's not true. It's not true. I'm not going to go crazy. And so I was walking him through that voice that comes up in his head. And so anyway, so he went through the day. He successfully completed his little fast day. And this morning when my wife was making his breakfast, he was like so lit up to eat. Like he was like the smells, and he was describing it and this kind of thing. He's in
touch with it.
And once he ate his breakfast today, he was like, this is the best food I've ever had. It's the same thing he eats all the time. Yeah. But his connection to it, his value, actually, I think that we become a little bit inundated by the consistency that we have with food today.
Absolutely.
So being able to take a step back and to really bring ourselves into a place where we're more present and to enjoy the experience, because it really is such an awesome part of life is eating. What if we had a tool that we can have more of these joyful experiences and get more, and probably we're going to have more satisfaction mentally by interacting with maybe some of our satiety hormones, for example.
Absolutely. No, I love that story. I mean, I think that, the dopamine system is just such an incredible system because it causes the seeking and this craving. It's really a molecule of craving. It's actually a cool experiment that illustrates this, that this was done in rats, but it's also true in humans, it turns out. Equivalent experiments have been done. Take 2 rats, put them near a lever press where they can get a really delicious food for a rat, and they'll lever press and they'll just eat and eat and eat. If you remove all the dopamine neurons, or in a human, if you block the ability for dopamine to function, people or rats will still lever press to eat, and humans will still eat. You can still experience pleasure without dopamine. But if you take that rat and you move it just 1 rat length away from the lever press, what you find is the one without dopamine won't even cross the cage to press the lever. So dopamine is really about the motivation to seek pleasure. Now, intermittent fasting is interesting because it does 2 things. It creates a heightened motivation. Your son was saying, I really, really want to eat. So the motivation is there. But then when you finally achieve it, when you finally do eat, you actually get dopamine release from that event. Now, the equivalent stuff in humans sort of points to the fact that if we do something that we enjoy and we do it over and over again, we really do get less enjoyment from it over time. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the phones. But so if we enjoy something, person, place, thing, activity, anything, taking some space from that will allow us to achieve more pleasure with it over time. I think about this sometimes in terms of human relationships now. It used to be when you said goodbye to somebody, you weren't talking unless you got on a phone call. Now you're texting all the time. And a very wise person once told me, it's okay to miss each other. And this is something that I think is missing from we are all expected to be in communication all the time. And that's beautiful too. You can share pictures, you can share experiences all the time. But we also know that relationships of any kind, to food, to other human beings, those are challenged by too much. It's not really connection. It's too much communication, but it's not really connection. So too much eating, but you're not getting the joy from the food. So you're eating, but you're not actually experiencing the food and it in its full pleasure, what it could do for you. Same thing with constant communication with somebody that you really care about. You think about it as we're so close, but actually in some ways you're making yourself chemically more distant. Taking some time, it doesn't have to be extended periods of time, and I'm not trying to shatter any relationships here. I'm actually trying to reinforce them, believe it or not. But taking some time where you're not in communication, and then it actually feels like a really potent thing when it comes in. That's because dopamine is the universal signature of craving and reward, whether or not it's for relationship, whether or not it's for food, whether or not it's for friendship. We've heard of oxytocin, this bonding hormone. These are new data, not from my lab, but the oxytocin system and the dopamine system are linked. Social connection is very rewarding. It releases dopamine, and right now people have been really separated, so I don't want to encourage more separation, but hopefully as we move forward through everything that's been happening, as we start to reestablish direct contact, people are going to start to feel more connected. I just saw my mother for the first time in a year, and it was a really wonderful experience because we haven't seen each other in a year, and that's unusual, right? And so you can get more out of the same experiences over time by just having some self-control over the kind of reflexive need to constantly push things back and forth. And of course, I realize maybe I'm just also trying to get people out of the need to constantly text back. It's okay if people don't text back right away. When they do, it'll feel that much better.
Do you remember there was actually a time when you could leave your house and you couldn't reach the person until they came back? Do you remember this time?
I do. I'm old enough to remember. It felt like another life ago, but yes.
Yeah, there was a time when people could actually leave, and also the same thing with, if you were dropping by to see somebody, whereas today it's just like, you better text me when you're outside kind of thing. Like, don't just knock on my door. Like, it used to be a pleasant surprise when somebody stops by. Like, hey, it's the Joneses, hey, how you guys doing? Today, if somebody even knocks on your door, you're like, who the hell is that?
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
The intruder.
We've kind of devolved in a sense with this, but then we have technologies made us more connected in another sense. So this is all powerful stuff. And Just bringing up this conversation with our modalities of eating, we've got to talk about the elephant in the room, which is here in the United States. We're the most obese nation really in the history of humanity, which is not a great award to be getting. And I want to talk about this because I think, unfortunately, we tend to point fingers at the individual and not at the systems. Mm-hmm. And also negating the fact that there are some profound changes that happen in the brain when we venture into a state of being overweight or obese. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought up pointing to the system and not to the individual. There are things that are clear. There are things that clearly are happening at the level of the food itself. That 10 years ago, if you talked about hidden sugars and chemical emulsifiers, you sounded like some, health food nut, basically. Okay, but now we can look to some of the most prestigious scientists and physicians around the world. For a good example is Dr. Robert Lustig. He's a pediatric endocrinologist at University of California, San Francisco, and he's talked about how the fact that making foods more tasty is one way to get people to buy more of them and eat them. And obviously, good tasting food, excellent tasting food is wonderful. Most people aren't cooking for themselves whole foods as much anymore. This is a big shift, right? Eating processed foods, et cetera, is problematic. Why? Well, now we can really understand some of the data. We have dopamine neurons in our brain that drive us to pursue more of whatever caused the dopamine release. Turns out we also have neurons in our gut. This is work by a guy named Diego Borges at Duke University. These are neurons in our stomach that send connections to our brain. Okay, this is the so-called gut-brain axis. This is independent for the moment of the gut microbiome. These are just neurons in our gut that send connections to our brain. And these neurons sense sugar, fat, and amino acids. Now, amino acids are actually quite good for us. They come from various forms of protein, animal and vegetable proteins. They are the building blocks for protein synthesis, and they're very important to life, right? They are essential. We also need essential fatty acids. So in reality, and I'm not low carb myself or anti-carbs, but there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. There's essential, you need proteins, you need fats, and if you use carbohydrate as a fuel, you need carbohydrates as a fuel. These neurons respond, however, also to sugar. And when we eat sugars, even if we can't taste them, what their group has shown, their lab has shown, is that these neurons become active and trigger our brain to seek out more of whatever food we are eating, independent of the taste. So the simple way to put this is, you think that you're eating these chips and these snack foods and these other highly palatable foods because they taste good, but you're actually eating them because your brain is craving the dopamine release in a subconscious way. So your nervous system is literally being tricked into pursuing more of these things, and it actually has a lot less to do with taste than you think. Now, the other problem with these really calorie-dense, highly palatable foods is that they make more bland foods taste really bland, at least for a while. And there's a nice literature related to this. There's a woman at Yale University named Dana Small, whose lab has looked at how flavors and desire for foods map onto one another. It's an extensive literature, but the long and short of it is that if you start to eat foods that are a little bit simpler, it doesn't mean you can't flavor your food, but a little bit simpler, that aren't so intense with so many flavors, then those foods take on the property of causing dopamine release, just like the really highly palatable foods. So there are hidden sugars that are driving more eating and overeating. There are these emulsifiers, and those actually, the chemical emulsifiers have been shown to disrupt the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome, we have a lot of species of little microbes living in our gut, which sounds gross, but they actually, if they are the right ones, they really help us. So much so that people who are obese versus people that are lean, if they swap their microbiota, they actually can do this. They can swap which sorts of little microbiota are living in the gut. Then people who are heavy get lean. And so you go, well, and they tend to crave healthier foods. So this is really interesting. And what it shows is that the gut is talking to the brain in a way that is below our conscious detection. I know this sounds crazy, but there's tons of data to support this now. One of the things that's very actionable that work at Stanford in the Sonnenberg lab has been shown to benefit this whole system is to keep a healthy gut microbiome. And the best way to do that turns out is not to take probiotics, which, by the way, are very expensive and often have the wrong species of probiotic in there, wrong bacteria, but rather to eat 2 to 4 servings of low sugar fermented food per day. So sauerkraut, pickles, not the ones loaded with sugar, but natto, kimchi. These are foods that throughout history have been used for various health benefits. So they tend to lower inflammation. This has now been well established. Lower inflammation, which is good for the brain and body. They can promote healthier eating. They can promote a healthier dopamine system, so to speak, that leads people to pursue healthier foods. So obviously there are people are overeating, but part of the reason they're overeating is not even their own bad conscious choices, is that their brain has been tricked into overeating. And so I think there's the physical exercise component, of course, but I think that we need to acknowledge that the system, now I really sound like the system with respect to processed foods is definitely rigged. And there's a whole thing around this that makes financial sense for, and I don't think conspiracy here, it's when foods can spoil on the shelf, they can't be listed as a commodity. And so there's a huge financial upside for being able to create foods that can have a long shelf life and that are therefore loaded with emulsifiers and disrupt the gut microbiome. There's a huge incentive for putting so-called hidden sugars into foods, even hidden false sugars like saccharin into foods, not to lower the caloric count, but because that actually can trigger these mechanisms, these bad mechanisms too. So I think we need to acknowledge that the number one thing that all of us can do is create a healthy gut microbiome. Well, there are 3 things. One is recognize that there are these subconscious things, that what you think you're eating, it may not actually be what you're eating, and that it's changing your appetite. So that raises the second thing, which is most people should probably try and eat whole foods. So if eating foods that you prepare, and then in non-processed foods. And then the other one is basically to create a healthy gut microbiome through the ingestion of 2 to 4 servings of fermented foods, which isn't much. It's a few spoonfuls of sauerkraut or a pickle, once or twice a day. Most of these foods are pretty tasty anyway, but most of us aren't consuming enough of those foods. And of course, there's the whole fiber discussion, which is kind of a controversial discussion, so I'll leave that out. But your gut is part of your nervous system, and it's telling your brain what you should pursue more of. So some of us are a little bit like robots with food. And I experience this, right? I confess I love chips, and I'll start, and then at some point, I'm not even tasting them. I'm just chucking them down my throat. And I'm like, what is going on here? And that mechanism has been kicked on, and it's the same way a gambling addict would be gambling without any concern for the outcome. We always think about the gambling addict or the chip eater thinking, oh, these are so delicious, or I'm going to get the big win. The gambling addict is actually in a reflex mode. They're just trying to hang in there and not suffer. And so that's why when we withdraw these things at first, we feel miserable. When we stop eating these highly palatable foods, this is work that's been done by my colleague Anna Lemke at Stanford on addiction of any kind. We feel miserable. We think like life is just terrible. People actually start to feel kind of depressed. But then slowly over time, that capacity to get dopamine from simpler whole foods starts to return. So it's the same process as we saw and we're talking about for the phone. So anyway, sorry again for the monologue.
No,
but
this is fantastic.
But I think once people realize that you got these chemicals and they're being controlled by external things, but you can take control of them, then I think it opens up a whole other avenue that isn't all the same things still apply, 150 to 180 minutes of exercise a week, eat whole foods. But somehow in my fantasy version of this, by understanding that the way you feel makes sense given what you've been doing, and the way you're going to feel better makes sense if you do the following things, I like to think it provides some relief to people that it's not always going to be a grind.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah, it's very simple, So I think a lot of things got gummed up when scientists figured out how to isolate flavors, gas chromatograph, being able to take these.
I apologize on behalf of the scientific community. we mean well. It's just sometimes industry picks up on it, and that's
where it goes.
Because most of us don't have companies or anything. Some do, but most are just. Scientists are nerds. We're just trying to figure out. Want to figure out how things work.
And then marketers tend to screw things up, and that bottom line. But basically being able to make things taste like other things, and kind of muddying up the waters of that brain-body connection.
I knew we were in trouble when we started merging Thai food with pizza. I'm serious. I remember thinking, what is going on? It was like, or that the chip suddenly needed, like growing up, I ate my fair share of Doritos. Okay. I did. Nowadays, I don't eat that kind of stuff, but I did. But then it was like the number of flavors that they were packing into this thing. And then it basically became like a styrofoam delivery system for intense flavor of all kinds. And the problem is not that, there's nothing bad about it per se. It's that it's shifting your nervous system so that other things don't taste good. And so that becomes the only thing that's going to do it for you. And I always say addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. And that can be extreme, like drug addiction and heroin addiction. But we have these little micro addictions, and we think we need something when actually we accidentally taught our nervous system that this is the stimulus for dopamine. And it's terrible. And we really should relieve ourselves of some of the blame. And, and there's no one company to point to. It's just humans stumbling over the process of being human is really what it is.
So I love that also you gave a simple tactic, which is, so we know we've got this flavor explosion available. Then let's get back to something to kind of buffer that, is just, let's eat a very simple food,
right?
Without all the dressing up, and just eat that actual food. Maybe 1 or 2 times a day, have just a regular actual food.
Right.
Don't try to not eat the Dorito, the Jumbo Jack bacon chili Dorito flavor, whatever, and just eat a carrot. Just see what that experience is like. Give your system that kind of input. And also, there was some great work done, and I love that we talked about this before we got started. Wim Hof, I had no idea that he had a twin, which is nuts. And I was immediately like, I want to study these two to see the differences. And one of the things that I came across a couple of years ago, still pretty recent data, is a study that was being accumulated on twins. It's like the biggest database of twins to see, what's happening with, identical twins specifically, differences in their microbiome, to see what the different outcomes would be as far as obesity. And they pinned down that changes in their microbiome from one twin to the next. A twin having this cascade of bacteria associated with insulin resistance, diabetes, and the other twin having this, quote, lean cascade of bacteria, and seeing this consistent pattern that one twin would gain weight while the other didn't, eating in the same diet, essentially living in the same household. That's the power that these microbes have. So you bringing that up and talking about that association is incredibly important. This is one of the things we want to try to address, because these microbes do have something to say about whether or not we're going to be obese.
They do. And I think that the 2 to 4 servings of fermented food per day, I think one reason I like that recommendation is the science points to it as beneficial. And also it's something to do as opposed to something to not do. I mean, there's a lot of restrictive practices that are associated with losing weight, et cetera. And those are hard because they're restrictive. But the addition of something that hopefully, I think most people like some form of fermented, low sugar fermented food. The gut microbiome is so fascinating, and it's an area that you can just think of part of you. It's like a little community that talks to the neurons that talk to your brain and really control your appetite. Some people start eating fermented foods and they lose their appetite for really sugary carbohydrate type foods. They just lose it completely. They just, for whatever reason, they don't crave that stuff anymore. And it's remarkable, but it makes sense. And the microbiome is involved in so many things. I think it's sleep being the fundamental layer of health and all the light and stuff that goes with it. But I think that the gut microbiome is right up there in the top 5 or so of critical aspects of our body that we all absolutely need to take care of. Yeah.
I love that. So add in some fermented foods. Another thing seen in the data is simply increasing the variety of foods that you're eating.
Right.
That's another simple intervention that we can do, because if you think about it, every food that we eat has its own microbiome in a sense. Mm-hmm. If we eat a blueberry, we're eating that blueberry's microbiome. If we eat an avocado, we're eating that avocado's microbiome. And so, because I think that we have this tendency, and I know that I did earlier on in my career, in looking at, again, probiotics and even prebiotics. And I think that creates this tunnel vision, right? Where we might go to Google and find here's the best prebiotic foods. Really, every food functions as a food for something else, for some form of microbes. And so we know clearly now that, having a diversity can help to fortify the diversity of your microbes. As your diversity goes down, your risk of diabetes goes up, your risk of obesity goes up, sleep problems, etc. So super simple stuff. Again, we don't have to try to stop doing everything, but just add in a little bit more variety.
Yeah, there's even some evidence that, and this is wild, and it's just one study, but my friend Andy Galpin, he's a physiologist and professor at Cal State Long Beach. He's a really skilled muscle physiologist, and he also does the training side. So he knows the stuff under the microscope really well, and he knows the actual practices. That a disrupted gut microbiome can actually prevent the adaptive responses to exercise, which is wild. Same caloric intake, same exercise. It's resistance exercise in this case. The muscle adaptation does not take place in what cases of what are called dysbiosis, where they're not getting enough variety in the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome is foundational. I think that we can talk about it in the context. I mean, it's been shown to improve symptoms of autism. I mean, there's so many things, cognitive function. It's a fundamental layer. I would say sleep is the fundamental layer, and then gut microbiome is right there in the foundation. And if you want to use the house analogy or building analogy, if the foundation is shaky, nothing else is going to work well. Everything else is going to seem harder. The electrical is going to go out. It's just unstable. So sleep and microbiome are two of the major pillars. They're not the only pillars, but they're two of the major pillars. And what's cool about getting good sleep and taking some control of the microbiome is it makes the other stuff that we're told to do easier, like making the choice to exercise, making the choice to make better food choices, making the choice to have some self-control with respect to the phone use, et cetera. So it sets a foundation. And that's why I like these kind of foundational health practices, because we've heard a lot over the years of do this one thing, and it does indeed work. But for people that have a hard time leaning in that direction, it's like, the door shuts immediately. But it's a pretty amazing thing when you start to see or interact with people that for the first time in their life, they're getting good sleep consistently.
Yeah. Another thing I want to ask you about is neuroinflammation. Inflammation taking place in the brain. There was some research out of Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and they were looking at this connection between inflammation in the brain and obesity, finding that test subjects tended to have higher rates of body fat when they had more brain inflammation. And on the other side, it's kind of a vicious circle. More body fat led to more inflammation in the brain. And so I think this is an overlooked issue as far as, again, how do we actually, quote, heal a metabolism when people are fighting these battles and not maybe considering like maybe our lifestyle, the things we might be consuming might be creating inflammation not only in our bodies, but in our brain as well.
Yeah, brain inflammation is really interesting. And nowadays we hear a lot about inflammation. I mean, the brain, as we discussed earlier, is a unique organ, but one of, for a variety of reasons, it can change itself, et cetera. It's kind of our master computer, if you will. But the other thing that's really unique about the brain is it doesn't have any pain receptors. So unlike inflammation in our body, which feels painful, like, oh, my knee's inflamed or my skin's inflamed, or you have an ingrown hair and it feels inflamed, you can feel it. When your brain is inflamed, there's no sensation of inflammation. That wasn't meant to rhyme, but it does. So brain, no sensation of inflammation.
Bars.
Yeah, terrible. I'm a scientist. I'm allowed to make bad jokes. So there are a couple things that are important. One, it takes us back to sleep. So one of the amazing discoveries in the last 5 years is the so-called glymphatic system. So we have lymph, which is a system in our body that moves around immune cells and other cells in response to infection. If you've ever had swollen lymph nodes, you have lymph nodes everywhere in the groin, the armpits, around the neck, etc., in the ears. But we also have a lymph system in our brain. It's called the glymphatic system because we have these cells called glial cells. So the G is for glymph. And it turns out that during deep sleep, the glymphatic system becomes very active, and there's literally a washing through of lymph-like fluid, especially in this little channel, like a little stream that exists between the brain and the skull, but also within the brain. And it's washing out debris and reducing inflammation. So all day long, whether or not we have a head injury or not, but, hopefully not, but whether or not we're just doing our normal activities or something very intense, there's debris. Neurons are very active nerve cells, among the most active nerve cells in our body, and they generate debris. And so the garbage needs to be taken out. And the glymphatic system is this sweeping out of the garbage each night that if we don't do, our brain starts experiencing inflammation. Now, inflammation in the brain does not mean that the brain is swelling. I think we get this, like the brain is swelling. No, it's actually the expression of these what are called inflammatory cytokines. And for those of you that are interested in this and are interested in inflammation in the body as well, these inflammatory cytokines come in a lot of varieties, but they tend to have a few names that you'll hear consistently. IL-6, interleukin 6. Tumor necrosis factor alpha, those are the main ones. Well, you can reduce levels of IL-6 in the brain, reduce inflammation, make neurons more stable and healthier over time by making sure that the glymphatic system is active. So that means getting regular deep sleep. And one of the best ways to really mess up your brain and your thinking is to not get deep sleep consistently or get enough of it. Now, I don't want to alarm people that aren't getting that and are trying, but it's really vital that you figure out how much sleep you need in order to be functional during the day. A good definition for insomnia, that's actually a clinical definition, is if you're falling asleep during the day, you're probably not getting enough deep sleep. Now, this brings me to the other issue, and because you were talking about specifically obesity and inflammation in the brain. One of the major blockades to deep sleep is sleep apnea. People fall asleep and they're breathing, obviously, and every once in a while, because carbon dioxide that we talked about before levels go up in the body, oxygen levels are dropping, carbon dioxide levels are going up, and then people are periodically waking up in order to grab more oxygen, because when carbon dioxide levels get high, it triggers the gasp reflex. Sometimes this is conscious and we wake up a lot. Most of the time, people don't realize that they are going in and out of sleep all night and they never get into that deep sleep. So now it's a two-pronged problem. On the one hand, they're heavy, so they're not breathing properly. Now, sometimes this can also be caused by just obstruction. It can even be caused, believe it or not, by if you sleep with your pillow and your head forward like you're texting all the time, but in your sleep, you can obstruct the airways and you're getting apnea and you're not getting deep sleep. You're not getting glymphatic washout. The brain is becoming inflamed. There's very clear evidence to support that. So one of the major issues that's causing apnea, not just in people who are obese, but in all people, is that people are becoming mouth breathers. Some of this has to do with the foods we're eating. Some of it has to do with propping our head up on pillows. Some of it is related to other factors. But unless one is speaking or eating, we should be breathing through our nose. Now, when we exercise, it's different. Exercise, you can nose breathe, but as you start to exert yourself more, there's a tendency to mouth breathe, and that's fine. There are opinions about this, but in general, it's fine. But by breathing through the nose more consistently, something that we can all do, it changes the shape of the airways. The sinuses dilate. A lot of people think they have deviated septum, when in fact they're just not breathing through their nose enough. James Nestor's book, Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art, covers this. There's a book from my colleagues at Stanford that was prior to that called Jaws, is a hidden epidemic. Breathing through the nose, believe it or not, allows the nasal passages to dilate, prevents sleep apnea, can help with the glymphatic washout, reduce inflammation, and this is true in all people. Now, the other thing this takes us to is breathing. So for some people who are challenged, they're overweight or they're challenged with obesity and they are trying to embark on a system of weight loss, breathing protocols are actually a wonderful entry point to that. And they're not a substitute for exercise, but as we talked about earlier, because you can do them anywhere, they teach you how to breathe through your nose. So some people will do a breathing practice, like a 10-minute a day deep breathing practice. There's studies on this now, purely through the nose. And at first it'll feel kind of restrictive, but actually over time it becomes easier to breathe through the nose. Then during sleep, they're breathing better. Some people will tape their mouth shut. That seems kind of dramatic, but I know people that are just putting some light medical tape over their mouth, so you're not gonna, you're not gonna suffocate.
Some people said it's a game changer.
Game changer. Some people will fall asleep just holding their mouth shut. I don't know how long that lasts, but shifting towards being a nasal breather is clearly a good thing to do. Also, the number of infections that people get is vastly reduced when they are mostly breathing through their nose. So a different colleague of mine at Stanford did a study of basically shutting the nasal airways or shutting the mouth most of the time, unless people are speaking or eating. When people are breathing through their mouth, they're susceptible to far more infections. we have a lot of things in our nose, along the mucosal lining of our nose, that serves as, it literally scrubs or kills bacteria and viruses better than breathing through the mouth. So you can't overemphasize the role of good breathing. But yeah, so for people that have sleep apnea, a lot of people get the CPAP and they'll get this device. Okay, if there's a medical need for that, but that's another example of treating the symptom, not really getting to the root cause. So I think we are going to start hearing more and more about this in years to come. So people should become nose breathers most of the time. Get your sleep right. That will reduce brain inflammation. Obviously, that 150 to 180 minutes a week of cardiovascular exercise is going to be easier for somebody that's accustomed to breathing hard. I have a friend who's former special operations military, and he always just says, look, the rule is very simple to getting healthy and staying healthy. Breathe hard for an hour a day. And I was like, does that mean I can just sit in a chair and breathe hard? He's like, you could, but it's easiest to do that by walking or running or doing some sort of work. And when you think about it, that's a significant amount of breathing hard per day. And that's just the breathing you're doing during exercise. How you're getting your hard breathing outside of exercise, that's your business. But an hour a day of breathing hard, I think, is a really good protocol. And it seems like a lot, but I think it could resolve a lot of major health issues. I really do.
When you just said it's up to you how you do it, of course, I thought about sex. I thought about movement.
Sure, there's probably other.
So you can make it creative with your breathing hard. You know, this doesn't have to be this one size fits all modality. And that's the great thing about all these things, is that, you know, there's so much variety that we have to choose from right now. So, you know, this is absolutely amazing. There's one more thing I want to ask you about, because we're living at a time where there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of fear, and you being somebody who knows so much about the human brain, I'm wondering what the connection would be or the impact on excessive amounts of stress. Again, it's not that stress is bad, but excessive amounts of stress and fear. Is there a connection between that experience and maybe some abnormalities taking place with our immune system and our immune response when interacting with pathogens?
Yeah, so long-term stress is bad for the immune system. This is based on data that goes back a long time, but the person who primarily gets the credit for this is a guy named Bruce McEwen, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he was, I think, well into his 80s, which is still early in my mind. But his lab at the Rockefeller University in New York has shown that when cortisol is elevated for too long or at the wrong times of day, it makes the immune system less effective in combating illness. So learn to control stress and you will enhance your immune system. The other thing that is, I think, really important to understand is what is long-term, what is short-term stress. I think we can throw some kind of crude guidelines at it. If you are feeling like you're not getting good sleep consistently for 3 nights in a row, you're starting to enter a period of long-term stress. So I think there are a lot of people out there that are in a mode of long-term stress. There are a huge literature out there of things that people can take, you know, ashwagandha and, you know, these kinds of things. But today we've mainly been focused on behavioral protocols, get the sleep right, et cetera. But if you're staying up late or waking up early and stressing throughout the day and you're in chronic for more than 3 days, you're in chronic stress. So I just want to be clear, because we hear about short-term stress and long-term stress, but rarely do people actually define what's long-term. Now, resetting oneself can be problematic, especially for people that have been in a long period of stress. And, you know, the last, whatever it is now, I can't even track, 18 months, has just been very difficult for everybody, right? No matter where people stand on the whole situation, it's just been stressful. So I think the practices that we talked about that actually might seem stressful, like the intense breathing, the cold showers, I wholeheartedly believe, based on data, that those can actually help people reset their relationship to stress and start to get themselves out of this chronic stress mode. The other thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention is that there was a study published in Science magazine, which is Science, Nature, and Cell are the sort of Super Bowl, NBA championship, and I don't know, got to give me another.
Stanley Cup.
Stanley Cup, there it is. For the Canadians, Stanley Cup of science. And there was a paper published in Science last year, maybe it was last year, showing that there is something called psychogenic fever, that there are areas of the brain that can convert a stress response into an actual fever. Now, this is important to understand why, in addition to the fact that it can happen. Remember earlier we were saying when you're stressed, you liberate all these killer cells in the short term that combat illness. And that's because you've got this one response system. Well, one of the ways that we kill pathogens, we kill bad things that enter our body, is with fever. Fever is an adaptive response designed to kill viruses and bacteria. Now, if fever goes too high, it can be dangerous, which is why people take fever-lowering drugs, Tylenol and things of that sort, to lower body temperature, other things as well. But fever is designed to cook those things because viruses and bacteria only can survive in a very narrow range. So it turns out that stress can actually activate fever. Now, whether or not one's stress is activated by a mental process or by some genuine thing that's invaded the body is rarely looked at. But it makes sense why you would have a fever. Just like when you're stressed about something, you get a shot of adrenaline and your heart races and you mobilize fuel to your legs, and that's why you want to move. It's hard to sit still when you're anxious or stressed. It's because it's designed to move you. Well, if you're stressed about something, the body also will generate this increase in body temperature that will allow you to kill off something that you perceive has entered your body. So I think that the takeaway message is that stress in the short term is adaptive. It's good for us. It combats all the bad stuff. Stress that extends out more than 3 or 4 days and is disrupting our sleep for more than 3 nights in a row, we really need to take that seriously. And whenever somebody says we need to take something seriously, that itself can be stressful. So I want to be kind in the delivery of this. Don't become alarmed. Just start to think about what are the levers and buttons that we've discussed today: the breathing, the cold water, the double inhale, long exhale, the sort of hyperventilation followed by a breath hold, the trying to not sleep in a way where your airway is obstructed, nasal breathing up, light in the morning, all these things. Try and think about which ones you can start to lean into without too much additional stress. And then let one of those open up the door to the next and to the next. So one door opens and another one and so on. And I think that's the way to approach it, because if we get into a catastrophic mode of, oh my goodness, I've been stressed for much longer than 3 days, and therefore my brain is inflamed and I'm going to dissolve, physically and mentally, that itself is stressful. So we have to escape that vicious loop. And the way to do that is very straightforward. It's with practices. The information, I hope, is helpful, but it's tools that really make a difference. And you got to use those tools. Knowing about them is the first step, but then you just have to implement them.
That's right. This has been phenomenal. And there's so many other things that we could talk about. And you've been talking about so many other aspects of science and human health on your new show. You just started a podcast recently. Can you let everybody know about your show and also where they can connect with you and get more information?
Sure. So the podcast is called Huberman Lab, and it's on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the standard places. And then on Instagram, I'm also Huberman Lab. And there I teach neuroscience in shorter snippets of a minute to 5 minutes. Some stuff that's covered on the podcast, but also some additional information. Those are the two main places that people can find us.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today.
Angiogenesis, we talked about fruit peel to help endothelial cells stay healthy. Immune system, we talked about broccoli sprouts. Let's talk about regeneration, stem cells. It turns out that cacao, dark chocolate,